Hello and welcome back to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This video is going to contain full spoilers for the entirety of the game. The very first topic is going to touch on some big shit you won't understand, you will not follow unless you actually know how the game ends. And these are spoilers for parts 5 and 6 of episode 3, the videos I've recorded. There are going to be some major content warnings for this. Again, starting straight off the bat, you can check the video description and the timestamps for an indication of where these content warnings are particularly discussed. But just in general, be warned that there will be discussions of abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, grooming, sexual assault of a minor, presumably. So yes, we are going to start with a pretty intense one, because it's Beatrice's backstory time. This gives a strange view to Beatrice's history because Beatrice is a composite character. Her backstory ends up being effectively a brief glimpse into original Beatrice, followed by Beatrice II, and giving some insight into modern-day Beatrice. Let's start with Beatrice II as the woman who is quite literally asking who she is and trying to get Kinzo to honestly engage with her on this topic. And obviously this also functions as a moment to ask, especially when we have more understanding of the story as a whole, who is Beatrice II? Beatrice II is referred to as being a woman who has no magical power. She is an extremely tragic figure, as all Beatrices are. Beatrice II can be quite tragic in how sheltered and how little of the world she understands and how little of her situation she ever comes to understand. She dies in this section, still not having understood where she came from, why she was there, how the one father figure she looked up to, who did not take good care of her in many ways, how he was effectively her jailer without ever being willing to admit it to her, while gaslighting her about how silly her questions were and trying to make her feel foolish for even questioning her existence, which would be a very natural reaction for any person in this situation who grew up their whole life contained within a compound that was fenced in. The early section with Kinzo, where he utterly refuses, not just refuses to answer her questions or refuses to engage with her questions, but outright tries to gaslight her about the idea of her questions having meaning or value. When she tries to ask who she is, he gives her a title he refers to as the Master of the Mansion, which is meaningless. That doesn't matter to her. She doesn't care. She has servants in some ways that's valuable for her comfort and that establishes her place in a certain hierarchy. But she doesn't care about that because she wants to know who she is. She wants to understand her identity and place in the world, something that has been robbed of her by her isolation. And then when she struggles with grasping this question, because it's a difficult thing to grapple with and maybe quite hard to do when you have been intentionally isolated and groomed to not have other people to relate to, Kinzo then leaps on this as you're just asking questions you don't even know what you want to know. This is ridiculous. Nobody has confused feelings that they're trying to feel out without a clear end goal. He makes her feel as though she has a curiosity with no point, that she's just playing around, and therefore he doesn't need to take her seriously at all. All the while, Kinzo clearly knowing that he is abusing his own child and the child of the woman he also abused. I've said it before, and I will say it again, Kinzo is the scum of the earth. In a game about understanding that's two sides of people and the good sides and the bad sides, not a more despicable man. But there's an unfortunate parallel, as we often see between Battler and Kinzo, Where Battler, seeing this scene, seeing even with his distrust of Beatrice, even with the obfuscation of the magical narrative, he sees all of this and he's like, well, yeah, don't teenagers always just kind of wonder who they are? Apparently, Battler does not have the capacity to empathize with this situation. He has obviously not literally been in this situation, though I would argue that metaphorically the difference between Beatrice II and any of the children or grandchildren is not vast. Many of them have certain walls placed around them which they theoretically could escape, but in practical terms cannot necessarily. Battler has maybe strayed the furthest by leaving his family. However, he does come back, and even in terms of separating himself, he still has some ties to the way he was raised and the island he grew up on with the rest of his family. It sticks with him even if he manages to step outside of it for some time. Getting back to the original point though, Battler, similar to Kinzo, dismisses this as like, yeah, this is a teenager thing. People think about who they are and try to figure out their identities. Battler is not willing to go the extra mile of thinking about what Beatrice II's life is. What has Kinzo done to her? What is Kinzo doing to her in this moment? This is an unfortunate reality about various kinds of victims of abuse where people are very willing to hand-wave abusive behaviours of all kinds. It takes a significant push to get someone to the point of thinking, this person has done something horrible, and I need to understand that it is not merely a little bit weird or a little bit too much. In many situations, including real bad situations, the quote-unquote polite thing to do in a situation is to not make a fuss. Even if, for instance, you might be in a train station watching a woman slap her young child repeatedly. The polite thing is to leave her be because it's her matter, it's her daughter, etc. But the actual compassionate thing to do is to step in and stop the child's abuse. This is not that different. To an extent, Battler is distancing himself by finding excuses. If you really pushed Battler on this in a way that Beatrice doesn't quite, you could probably get Battler to admit specific things about how abusive this is, how shitty this is, how deeply disturbed Kinzo's behavior is in this situation. But just presented it fairly detached, he finds the excuses. He finds the reasons to think, oh, this is probably fine. And, in general, in abusive situations, this is extra likely to happen when a person has a personal connection to the perpetrator. As much as everyone talks about Kinzo, literally even calling him abusive, Battler is still pretty happy to be like, yeah, teens is just like this though. He apparently does not feel like he needs to reckon with Kinzo's often referred to abuses, because to Battler, it's just his grandfather. He's kind of scary, but he's fine. As the conversation goes on, I find it a little bit more understandable how Battler is hesitant to believe what Beatrice says, because she is using magic to obfuscate the quote-unquote objective facts about the situation. Beatrice does not come right out and refer to the multiple generations. She doesn't refer to the fact that there was an Italian woman named Beatrice who came to this island. To be fair to her, if she told Battler that an Italian Nazi had come to this island with a boat full of gold, I don't think he'd believe that either. But regardless, her using magical terms obfuscates things. I've said before that in some ways you can use the magical terms and the magical narrative to not have to deal with the upsetting and nitty-gritty parts of these stories, and we see this again as Beatrice does this in this section. She refers to Beatrice I committing suicide. Beatrice talks around this. She talks about shedding her cage of flesh, But Battler point blank refuses to allow her to do this and doggedly insists she explain exactly what she means. And we'll see by the way the conversation wraps up, in part this is because Battler is interested in the backstory in so much as it will give him clues. He is not in this moment interested in Beatrice as a person and understanding or relating to her. He is listening like he is reading a mystery novel and going, well, yes, I need to know the backstory of the perpetrator, because that feeds into their motive. Though, even at that, surely he could see the motive here, but he doesn't quite seem to dig into that either. Also, Beatrice referring to a cage of flesh is fascinating and a really good, horrible phrase. It is a viscerally upsetting idea, being imprisoned within your own body, and this certainly lends credence to trans readings of Umineko in general, but in particular, Beatrice's situation where she is trapped not just by being in a body she maybe doesn't like, because I don't get any real sense that that's what Beatrice the First had to deal with, but that Beatrice the First had to deal with the fact that Kinzo had an interest in a particular body of flesh, a particular cage of flesh, and having no ways of exiting the situation, she chose the one way where she could cast off the cage, and to her mind, take away the body Kinzo desired. Unfortunately, Kinzo is not like most men, as we are often reminded. And Kinzo is perfectly willing to recreate that body again in the hopes of recreating the same person. Kinzo raises Beatrice II in this Western-style mansion with all this elegant stuff because Kinzo is trying to create a woman simultaneously in the image of Beatrice I, but also in Kinzo's image of what Beatrice should be. Those are conflicting things because, as we know, the first Beatrice did not stick around for Kinzo. So in that respect, he presumably does not want a carbon copy of the original, and yet wants to make a close enough copy while modifying the situation to his needs. Again, fuck Kinzo. But what this ends up producing is a deeply sheltered woman. A woman who feels like a child to Rosa as a child. A woman who seems deeply immature and has not learned of the world as a whole. This is not really the Beatrice Kinzo would claim he was looking for. And in some ways, this indicates the dichotomy of things where the cage of flesh is not the deciding factor of the soul inside. Even if the soul reincarnates and the cage of flesh is, as best as possible, replicated, the environment that the cage and the soul reside in also affects things. It does not matter that Beatrice's soul returned, it does not matter that the cage of flesh was quite a copy. At least allegedly. Because by being sheltered, this is simply a different woman who has a different experience, and quite honestly, a distinct lack of experiences because of Kinzo's grooming. And as rich and visceral as the cage of flesh metaphor is to me, Battler simply finds it unrelatable. Beatrice says she was shut up in this body, meaning Beatrice II, which Battler finds confusing. And part of this is Battler not quite getting the magical narrative, not getting the obfuscation being employed to elide some of the really awful details of incest here. But I do also read this as being a situation where Battler has simply always felt attuned to his body and never really understood the notion that perhaps someone could feel trapped in their body, unhappy with it, or feel ill fits them like a bad suit. In this way, the cage of flesh metaphor is a useful attempt to communicate with Battler, but is insufficient when he is still keeping things at arm's reach and is not willing to engage with something that does not align with how he already does understand things. And as a capper to Kinzo's sins, here's a quote from Beatrice. Kinzo accomplished even the miracle of creating life, and simply to shut my soul up in that cage. That he would show such magical power simply because of his own love, a thoroughly terrifying person. And I would just quadruple underline his own love. Not a reciprocal love, not the woman I love has a terminal illness and wishes she could stay with me, so I will bring her back. No, this is a selfish love. This is simply Kinzo asserting what he himself wants. And then we get to a break point here where both sides of this conversation lose patience. Battler makes clear that he considers any hint of magic here mumbo jumbo, and Beatrice shows her intense displeasure at his mockery of what is clearly a traumatic backstory involving two women who died for this man's wishes. And I find it interesting that Battler feels bad when he sees that it's upset her and tries to reach out with an olive branch and thinks he is being conciliatory, but only insults her when it seems like he's still not taking things seriously. When he suggests that they have a bit of a story instead of a tea snack, because this is a clear demonstration that he thinks she is upset, but he's still not reckoning with the fact that she is telling a traumatic story and he has been extremely rude about it multiple times now. Going beyond them trading barbs, because this is an interesting development in this episode, but Beatrice has set up an antagonistic relationship between them. They jab each other, they verbally joust all the time. In this conversation with the backstory, you'll notice Beatrice does not retaliate against Battler's dismissive words at any point. Beatrice is being quite sincere in just laying out this story. And it's the fact that failing to pick up on this vibe, Battler simply keeps kind of poking her and just being like, ridiculous, isn't it? Ha ha ha, how silly. And she does not have it. She gets tired of it and says, well, fuck you then. I'm done. I'm out. In some ways, this reveals something fun about Beatrice, because in the narration, Battler says it looked like, even though making fun of people was her specialty, she was horrible at being made fun of by others. And I think, like with Ava, you actually need to flip that sentence on its head. Because she was horrible at being made fun of, she loves to make fun of other people. Beatrice is deeply sensitive. Beatrice has had a lot of stuff. Beatrice has some real trauma to manage, and so she tends to attack other people. She tends to go on the offensive and put herself in an elevated position. She uses any kind of power she has to demean others. Because she knows what it's like to be demeaned. She knows what it's like to be put down, to be under someone else's thumb, and she doesn't like it. So she grabs the situations that allow her to flip that narrative, because she doesn't want to be under someone's thumb. And part of the story of episode 3 is Beatrice coming to learn the fact that her behavior is actually pushing Battler away and making it harder for Battler to understand her. And if I remember right, episode 3 is a little bit about Ava never learning this. Ava never quite learning that she needs to stop putting out those barbs. But also, episode 3 is fun because Beatrice sort of fakes learning that lesson in a really good way. But we'll get there. after Beatrice sets up this backstory, we get Rosa's story of how Beatrice II lost her life, or her physical life, if you want to put it that way. Similar to Maria, we get a brief note where all of the men are urging this person to give them information they seek, while Kyrie, as a woman in the situation, is a little bit more tactful, talking about if what Rosa's saying happened, it's traumatic. Though, I find it interesting, that framing, because overall, we tend to see Kyrie as someone who also wants to extract information from people. The difference is not an innate caring angle that only women have. The difference is in an expectation of the women to be able to manage people's emotions while extracting the information they want. And this story obviously gives us a good window into Rosa's psychology. In particular, just the reason Rosa runs away in the first place is because she's upset about not feeling like she excels at anything. As the youngest of Shoramiya, she is simply the bottom of the totem pole. Which we will talk more about later when we reveal that Rosa is pretty smart and integral to solving the epitaph for this episode. But another line here that slips under the radar if you're not paying attention. When introducing the story, Rosa's narration says, "This is what happened on the day I experienced my mind going blank for the first time." Excuse me, for the first time? Are you telling us, Rosa, that blackouts are a recurring thing for you? Could this be related to how you treat your daughter? And are they perhaps real serious episodes you should be dealing with that might be tied to an experience you had with someone who was your responsibility who fell to harm, and you both blamed yourself and tried to find excuses where you could blame her for the situation you were in, all the while not quite acknowledging the grandfather who caused both of your situations, who engineered the actual conditions and the real stress and trauma involved, but because he was not actively directly involved, gets off scot-free. Also, a really tiny but insightful exchange between the siblings, where Rosa explains the kind of stresses she was under. And then, Ava, how shameful. If you were scolded because of your grades, all you had to do was work harder. Klaus replies, "You mustn't say that. Doesn't Rosa have her talent as a designer instead?" Narration, literally speaking, he was covering for Rosa, but everyone knew that Rosa's company hadn't been profitable. And then finally Rudolph replies, "Quit it. This is no time for sarcasm." I won't say it often, but poor Rosa. Especially with the understated thing here being, Rosa, as an intelligent person, which we will see later, could not simply just work harder and get better grades. Because if she outdid Ava, what the hell is Ava going to do to her? Why would Rosa want to surpass any of her siblings? Why would Rosa want to try at anything any of them even remotely touches? How does she find a way to succeed without impinging on any of them? And obviously, one answer is, I guess nobody else does a design business. I could go do that. And she doesn't really care about it, because design is not a thing she showed any aptitude or interest in as a child. It is simply an area that does not collide with any of her extremely self-conscious siblings. So no, Ava, she did not simply have to work harder, because if she got good grades, she would get something way worse than a scolding. As I said earlier, when Rosa talks to Beatrice II, Rosa is struck by how childish Beatrice II appears to be. And one thing I find interesting is that to Rosa, this childishness partly is that Beatrice does not have a distrust of people. She was too straightforward. She was naive and trusting. Rosa, as a child, has already learned to be distrusting because of the environment she is in, because she has so many people to distrust. But of course, the tragic undercurrent of this is that Beatrice has only one key person in her life, Kinzo, and she should be distrusting him. He is the slimiest man she could have as her main contact, and she has learned no distrust of him because he has damn sure made well that she does not. This is again how grooming works. You've got to make that person have a positive relationship with you and no hint of any distrust, fear, or suspicions. And then poor Beatrice II dies. In some ways, Beatrice's ending to her life is maybe the happiest she gets to be, as she escapes the finite confines of her prison and has a taste of how endless the world could be, even if she tragically gets only a taste. And then Beatrice breaks out the first stage of a key red truth to the game, that there are no more than 18 people on the island. This is a real juicy red line, and one thing that I saw even on a first read through was, interesting, it specifies humans and not people. Furniture is not human, as we are often told, so who is and is not counted in this? This is something I was thinking about even before we got confirmation that Kinzo is dead, even before we get to learn about the truth of the physical body behind Shannon, Canon, Beatrice. Just thinking thematically really has you wonder, why would you use the word human if it was not meant to be somewhat exclusionary as opposed to the word person, perhaps? Again, because of the red truth's nature, you could claim it's trying to be very direct and objective and refer to, oh, well, it's not talking about other creatures. But again, in a series that has been hammering on the idea that furniture is not human, you really gotta think about this point. And it's genius phrasing from Beatrice to corner Battler because of his narrow view on personhood. And of course, the real genius of this move being that Beatrice can ratchet that number down 2 more times and still be objectively correct. But I think one of the other things that's important to this coming in this section is how Beatrice's backstory ties her directly to Kinzo, and how both literally but also in truth, this red truth tells Battler he cannot try and divorce the idea of the culprit from the people he knows. The problem is coming from inside the house. He cannot keep pretending that some external person is the cause of problems. Look at fucking Kinzo, I will beg you again. So he needs to accept that within the people he knows, there is someone capable of murder. And this does even come on the heels of him denying the possibility that Kinzo could do a sacrificial ritual with a bunch of his family and servants. And then we move on to the beginning of the first Twilight. First of all, we get Kinzo here, and in a fun little bit of what I'm not quite sure is irony, because I don't know who theoretically is speaking for Kinzo in this magical scene. Kinzo talks about the way that the clock technically reaches 24 but really gets reset to 0, metaphors that to a person's life in a way that's pretty descriptive of him, a man who is talked about of having done great things, having resurrected a family, and is simply a corpse being hidden in order to avoid the legal complications of his son's fuck-ups. And of course, then we get to see Kinzo's special tarot card method, where he lays out some cards, does a reading, and then goes, I don't like that, and does it again. The narration itself points out how this is a little bit foolish because the tarot cards are simply a random number generator, and the idea that you'd rerun it to get better results is not in the spirit of the game, is not in the spirit of how this works. What the narration doesn't quite point out is that the reason you shouldn't really do this is you would say that in life you do not get do-overs. You simply deal the cards, you get a hand, and then that is your hand and you must accept it. However, Kinzo is not like other men, is he? Kinzo lost a woman he loved and decided to recreate her, and then did that again. Kinzo is a man who will use his privilege, his power, his prestige, and his money to force situations to try and get what he wants. But of course, we know that that doesn't really work out for him even then, because even in real life, when you are forcing do-overs, when you are forcing a second or third attempt at something, it is simply not going to just align with what you want because you have forced it. You have increased your odds by getting yourself a second or third hand, but at the end of the day, just being a stubborn, powerful man does not simply translate to results. However, in this scene, he does come to accept that the tarot's not going to give him the result he wants, for the simple reason that he is dead. So he cannot survive, even if he is not quite literally killed by the events of the game. There is no version of the cat box where he gets out alive. I have only stray notes about a long section of this, but we come through to after Canon has his fight and then realizes he has a hopeless fight against 6 more stakes. Beatrice has a bit of a meltdown again as Shannon continues to just stoically not give Beatrice an inch. And this section feels like it functions as 2 kind of cappers here, where it's a restatement of what I said earlier. Beatrice is aggressive, insulting, demeaning to people because of her insecure position. Beatrice here asserts that she's a human, which is interesting because she will often refer to herself more as a witch in a way that feels like it is not synonymous with human. Here she is declaring a personhood in a way that I read as this is the only way that a person could come from this situation, that she could be a human, I should say specifically, compared to Canon or Shannon who have hopeless futures that cannot go anywhere. Unless of course they get to the Golden Land and the humanity is almost bestowed to one of them. But again, crucially, only one of them. And then the other half happening here, of course, is that Beatrice, feeling this kind of insecurity, is brutal and aggressive and undignified, in Ranove's words, to people around her in a way that drives them away when, in theory, perhaps Beatrice might benefit from a conversation with Shannon. Perhaps Beatrice could use some of the peace Shannon has achieved. But the metaphysical situation of Beatrice might be too complicated for her to back out of what's going on. Even so, perhaps it would help her to be able to talk to somebody who has accepted a kind of personhood that she feels is out of reach. That's going to do it for this section. This was a big one, and it's really made a lot more sense on a second time through. It's one where I did pick up on some of Ava's situation and how unfortunate it was the first time, but you really get a grasp for how shitty this situation is this time through. To give you a clue, in my first reading, I was certainly skeptical of how Kinzo and the original Beatrice's relationship could have gone, but it's only on this read through it occurred to me that clearly the first Beatrice threw away her cage of flesh to escape Kinzo. So, thank you for watching this video, look forward to the next one, and fuck Kinzo yet again.